Let's check in with a great customer of ours, S&P Global, to hear about the structure that they have implemented in their cloud operation to stay focused on the business outcome and accelerate time to market. I'm so excited to have you because I believe you have an amazing story to share about how you use multi-cloud to accelerate your modern application development and in turn your business. So welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Vittorio. I really appreciate it.
So let's start by describe your role and what you do at S&P Global.
Sure. So I'm currently head of technology platforms and operations for the engineering solutions division at S&P Global. We were formerly IHS Markets up until about 3 weeks ago, and I'm responsible for the infrastructure platforms that support our revenue generating applications for the division, and how are we going to operate them. How do we deliver the solutions to our developers, which in turn enable them to develop solutions for our customers?
And this is very topical because the way you set up your infrastructure to support modern application development is undergoing a lot of changes, right? So tell us about the challenges you're facing today with your on-prem presence and you're moving to the cloud and the whole thing.
Absolutely. So we've got, like many companies, we have data centers. We run VMware cloud, private clouds, using things like the vRealize suite to manage that. We've also got extensive presence in AWS, Azure, and other public cloud providers, which we have to manage. And one of the challenges that we're faced with, particularly as we modernize our applications, is I have to deal with these multiple different operating models for each one of our public cloud environments and for our on-prem systems, which, as you can imagine, makes for a lot of operational complexity from my team's perspective.
And so how have you tackled these challenges?
Yeah, great question. So we took a step back, and it was very clear that we needed to come up with a common operating model for the cloud. And the obvious choice for that was to look at Kubernetes. Now I can go into AWS or Azure and look at EKS and AKS and Kubernetes as a service, etc. But I still then have to have these engineers with AWS or Azure specific expertise, and I want to operate in a multi-cloud environment. I don't want to tie myself to any one of the hyperscale cloud providers, whether it's through concentration of business risk, or from a sort of a cost arbitrage perspective. I want to be able to leverage all of the cloud providers in a fairly agnostic manner for my business. And that sort of led me to say, well, okay, great. Kubernetes makes sense from a sort of an application dial tone perspective. But this is where something like VMware Tanzu really comes to the forefront and enables me to have a consistent operating model across the public cloud and my private cloud environments. So I can start to have a standardized application development environment for my consumers.
As you adopted Tanzu, how has that changed the way you operate, and especially when you have the launch of a new application in production?
Sure. So as we're sort of ramping up our Tanzu usage, it's very much a case of, before, even when we were using Amazon's own bundled Kubernetes service, we'd deploy a cluster and then we'd have to do a bunch of manual work, and we could wrap that up in some Terraform scripts potentially, but there was still a fair bit of heavy lifting for us to do there. With things like TKG and mission control, we can very rapidly stand up a new Kubernetes environment for a given application, or partition an existing one into a new namespace for these applications. So we can, my goal is to get to the sort of situation of environment as a service for our developers, so that we're not standing in their way. They're not waiting for us to spin up infrastructure or cloud services for them. And that's, Tanzu's a real enabler for that. I can give them an API and say, hey, point here, and you can spin up your own Kubernetes cluster if you really want to, without having to worry about whether they know AWS or Azure or GCP.
So Ben, that's great. So with Tanzu and Kubernetes, you created this abstraction, this way to create new applications in multi-cloud. Tell me what you're doing with your enterprise applications.
Yeah, great question. Like any business, we have a variety of applications, particularly in our on-prem data centers, and they'll range from, we do have containerized applications there, and those will be lifted and shifted up into Tanzu is my goal with those. But then we also have applications that run the extremes from a Corba-based Solaris, where we're still sort of looking at a rewrite there, all the way into applications that have things like Oracle RAC databases, which don't naturally translate into public cloud because of the scale of the database. For those, that's where VMware's cloud on AWS is a fantastic answer. VMC enables us to take something like Oracle RAC, lift it up into the cloud, and potentially even run it in a hybrid way so that we've got cloud native applications accessing that Oracle database in a performant manner inside VMC.
And can you elaborate on how you standardize operation for your new application development?
Yeah, sure. So the way I started thinking about this is if we go back to looking at the data center in the early 2000s, we had, every time we wanted to start doing something, whether it was building a new application server or something, someone would have to go and rack a server, etc. And then virtualization happened. We had the early days of ESX, and that kind of became the default operating model for the data center. And then, okay, well, zoom forward 20 years, we're now in the situation where we're in the cloud, everyone can spin up resources here, there, and everywhere, and it's kind of unmanaged chaos. And then we have the new paradigm for the cloud, which really is Kubernetes. And I think Tanzu and Kubernetes is to the cloud what ESX was to the data center 20 years ago. And what that is enabling us to do is provide a standardized environment with strong governance in all of the clouds in a consistent way that enables our developers to have a very clear understanding of what they can expect to get when they go to start deploying their applications there. And the standardization is absolutely crucial. I mean, I have a saying I use a lot: standardize, automate, orchestrate. If you don't have standards, it's very hard for us to wrap things together and have this sort of end-to-end experience for our developers. So that's why that gets to be so important for us.
I think that's a great analogy for many of our customers, right? Creating the level of abstraction. On-prem, we use the hypervisor, right? You aggregate, you automate and orchestrate,
Yeah.
as you say. In the cloud, we have to do it at a different level, and Tanzu and Kubernetes provide that level of abstraction that accelerates the business. Given that you're ahead, I believe you're ahead of many, many customers out there. If you have to tell them one thing to start with the right foot as they embark in modern application development using Kubernetes eventually across multiple clouds?
If I had to tell people one thing, I think it would be, it's not about the technology. It's ultimately about the people and the process, and bringing your DevOps teams along with you and making sure that they understand why you're going into this multi-cloud world. And that changes a little bit of how they're going to think about things. And then, that adapts your process and then ultimately your technologies. But you've got to bring people with you on this journey. People are the most important part of this.
Ben, this was a fantastic story. Thank you for sharing with our customers. I cannot thank you enough.
No, my absolute pleasure, Vittorio. Thank you for having me.